Welcome to Highly Sensitive, Happily Married, the podcast that teaches you to not only have an easier marriage as a sensitive woman, but to have one that feels more amazing by the day. Where you'll hear relatable stories, love advice that works, and coaching on how to have a marriage where feeling upset and disconnected is a thing of the past, and where instead a sense of loving connection and even fun and lightness is the norm. I'm Hannah Brooks, highly sensitive person, love expert, and marriage coach, and I'm so happy to be on this journey with you. Hello, beautiful, deep feeling, and sensitive women. Welcome to episode 170, where we're going to talk about when self-ownership and self-reflection feels painful. So, in our lives, in our relationships, there will inevitably be times where we need to take a look at our own selves and at how we are approaching the relationship and our partner, if we have any chance of having a great or even good marriage. We all of us do things that are not ideal for deep intimacy, for maintaining or deepening that loving connection that we all want with our partner. We really are all imperfect relators in our own ways. Some of us may be more critical and nitpicky about our partner's actions. Some of us may avoid talking about difficult topics. Some of us may tend to fall into blame. Some of us may not be good at listening, or maybe we get defensive, right? There are so many things. I talk a lot about the backfiring tactics. Those are some of the primary patterns or habits or ways of interacting that we can get kind of trapped in as humans. And if you're interested in learning more about them, if you haven't heard that episode, the most recent one about the backfiring tactics, the most comprehensive episode about the backfiring tactics is episode 159. So totally go have a listen if you haven't. But my point here is that all of us have things that we bring to relationship that actually make things harder in our relationship, that can be divisive instead of connecting. And the truth is, unfortunately, that it really can feel quite uncomfortable to look at those patterns, those things that we bring, those ways of interacting that cause more pain than connection. It can be difficult to face the ways that we ourselves are perhaps contributing to a less than great relationship. Yeah. So I want to address that today and how you can do the necessary self-reflection and take the necessary self-ownership you need to grow and to make the loving changes on your end that will allow you to steer your marriage in a much more loving and connected direction. Right? I want to address how you can do that in a way that doesn't feel bad, right? That actually feels good. Because of course you want to grow and get better at relating if you want a great relationship. That's just a simple fact that to have a better relationship, we need to grow. And that requires, of course, looking at ourselves with real honesty. And luckily, it does not need to feel awful. Like I just said, it can even feel good to look at those sticky, unskillful, or not so pretty patterns that we can fall into when we look at them with the right attitude and with a quality of self-support, which I'll get into. So I have talked about this some before. In fact, it's woven into almost all of the episodes because it's so important. But I also realized I wanted to do another whole episode on this because of a question that came up during the Closer to Your Husband in 7 Days challenge that I was guiding recently. And because I think this is one of those things that we just cannot revisit and remind ourselves enough, especially as women who are often socialized to be harsh with ourselves and to not be self-encouraging. I also thought this would be a really good topic to follow up last episode with. Last episode, we talked about being who you want to be, being the partner you want to be in your relationship. Because even in looking at who we do want to be, it can bring up some hard feelings about who we are being currently. So I wanted to acknowledge that and get you some help with that. So we're going to do that now. But a little backstory First, a couple weeks ago, a big group of women joined me in the Closer to Your Husband in 7 Days challenge. This is a course where I challenge you to do one very specific thing a day that's proven to create more connection and closeness with your spouse. And as a kickoff for this course, that's now an on-demand course, you can absolutely get access now or anytime to just go through it on your own at your own pace. But as a kickoff, I hosted it as a group event and we all went through it together. And I hosted live calls and people wrote in their questions and things they wanted help with. So one wonderful, motivated woman, Jen, found herself getting really hooked on that 4th day activity. And that lesson, that activity for that day is less about adding in something to create more closeness and more about subtracting something that leads to division, which obviously will allow for more closeness, right? So to subtract or to stop doing that thing that creates division, the first work is to simply self-reflect, right? To look at where and how you might be doing something that's divisive, how you might be doing something that's backfiring, that's creating discord, right? You need to have awareness of it and how you are doing this thing that is making your marriage less wonderful than it could be. But again, the problem is that can feel hard to do. It can feel painful to look at that. It can bring up shame and guilt and regret and other painful emotions. And this is what happened for Jen as she started to look for this and at this specific thing that she discovered. So as is not uncommon, as she was starting to look at where she was contributing to disconnection, she started feeling bad. And in the challenge, in the course, I actually give a very specific thing to look at. So it's not so general as like, just look for places where you're contributing that aren't so great, right? I give very specific things to look for. And I'm not going to go into that now. Right now, we're just talking in general about looking at places where you're contributing that could be divisive or generating more pain and less intimacy. In any case, Jen was feeling bad, and so she wrote in for my help. And I want to share the basics of her question here now and dive into my answer, because I do think many of you will be able to relate to her experience and will want to know how to avoid feeling so bad when looking at the ways in which you have room to grow when it comes to relationship. So she wrote, "This is very ugly and hard for me. I had a hard time with this one and have been trying to see where I do this. After deeper work and Googling how spouses and partners do this, I found it at last. Not pretty, not happy at all, very sad, embarrassing, and upsetting work. I am not enjoying this part and I'm having trouble with this. My sister said it was okay and it reminded her of shadow work, and some people face it, work through it, and heal from it, and others just give up. I'm tired. I'm tempted to give this one up. It's hard. It's making me mad and sad." So, some of you might have felt this before when trying to face and look at things in yourself. And I just want to say how much I admire Jen for her vulnerability and her honesty with me. And I want to thank her for being so honest. And I know that she's not alone in this. I actually think this is one reason people tend to avoid personal growth and relationship improving work, and why they're so much more likely to focus on where their partner isn't being a good partner and trying to get him to be different, because it can be too painful to start looking at where we ourselves are not being the best partner. So Jen's question is, how can it not feel so painful? How can it feel more peaceful? So to answer that question, first we need to understand why it feels painful in the first place. So I've noticed that it really is so easy, unfortunately, when it comes to personal growth and self-improvement work in any realm, but especially in relationship work, to do what I call using the work against ourselves. In other words, it's so easy to do it with a lot of self-judgment and self-blame, to beat yourself up and tell yourself you're bad and wrong and awful for basically not being perfect, for not doing it well right off the bat, for not knowing how to do it well, whatever it is, right? We can do this with exercise. We can do this with learning an instrument. We can do this with anything, any realm of our lives we want to improve. And again, it's especially easy to fall into around relationship. But whenever we feel bad about seeing our own behaviors, examining our own imperfect ways and habits, it is always because we are judging ourselves. We're measuring ourselves against some crazy ideal standard, or we are blaming ourselves. We're being harsh to ourselves instead of being accepting and compassionate. It really is a big, strong dose of our inner critic rearing its head. And when we come from self-judgment and blame like this, we are going to feel so crappy because it will always call up shame. And it will call up disappointment in ourselves and even anger at ourselves. And of course, that doesn't feel good. But even worse than that, those feelings are going to prevent us from growing. Being sort of sitting in these feelings are going to make it more likely that we keep doing the thing that we would like to grow out of. Because shame will just lock us into a cycle of more unskillful behavior. Now, it's so normal for this self-judgment and shame to come up, partially because we've been socialized to be self-critical. Most of us have seen judgment, blame, and criticalness left and right in our lives. If not from our parents and in our families, all you have to do is look anywhere online or in the media and you'll see it, right? It abounds in our culture. And on top of that, of course, we also come wired with these big old lizard brains, as you've heard me talk about so many times. And our lizard brains love to judge, even ourselves. The lizard brain loves to declare wrong, bad, awful. And yes, it can definitely point that towards others, but it will declare such things equally loudly, if not more loudly, about ourselves. So it's no wonder that we feel bad when we go to look at where we could do things differently or grow as partners. Our brains naturally and innately want to focus on the badness, the wrongness. So I hope that just understanding that that's sort of like this instinctual thing, as well as something you've been kind of enculturated into. Is that a word? But I also want you to know that just because the human brain tends to focus in on badness and wrongness, it doesn't mean your imperfect ways that you relate to your spouse are bad or wrong. They may not be helpful, they may be unskillful, but they are also not bad. They are not evil. And they're not even weird. I'm going to circle back to that in a moment, but I want to emphasize this first. The most important thing as we look at where we can improve how we do relationship is that we do it from a kind place, a gentle, curious, and deeply self-compassionate place. That we do it with love, with self-love and acceptance, in other words. It has to be approached as an act of love for ourselves instead of an act of war against ourselves. That's when self-reflection will feel like it is for us instead of against us. So I want to dive into some concrete tips now on how to feel so much better and even good about looking at your own less than ideal behaviors and ways of being in your relationship. Not to give you a pass and encourage you to ignore those things, but so that you can grow with much more ease. So you can do the work necessary to be the partner you really do want to be in your marriage and create the kind of loving, supportive relationship you really do want. Because this work is meant to feel positive, to feel loving, and lead to an unfolding of more love. And we can't get love from hate or harshness or judgment. We can only get love from love and kindness and a gentle, soft, open heart. And that starts with bringing that to yourself. All right, so I'm going to give you 7 tips. Are you ready? The first one is understand humanness. It will always feel bad if you're judging yourself for doing things that are only human. So for any of you for whom looking honestly at yourself feels bad, for any of you who find it hard to look at the places that you are imperfect, it's time to amp up the self-compassion and acceptance of your humanness. So hear me, you are not bad for having unideal patterns and habits. whatever they may be. Falling into reactivity, getting gripped by blame, getting controlling, right? Falling into the backfiring tactics. None of these, doing any of these, does not make you bad. Not one tiny iota. It makes you human. So many people do these. Most people, maybe all people to some degree or at some point in their lives. It is literally in our wiring. It is in our DNA. It is in our genetic and cultural inheritance. It is not a personal badness of yours. It is a collective challenge we humans are all struggling with. We could say it is part of the human condition, a part we can work with and grow beyond, but it's like we come into this world bound to have these challenges. I like to say it is not your personal fault. It is more the fault of our physiology, our genetic inheritance, and the things that have been passed down from our ancestors and the things we've absorbed from the modern culture around us. And in many ways, we are like sponges and we just soak that up. And then we're bound to kind of act it out. So it is a collective challenge. And in fact, to be one of the rare people facing it, addressing these challenges, working to grow in these areas, you are actually so courageous and strong and amazing. You're amazing for being willing to face this not so pretty part of yourself. Many people will not be so courageous and so empowered. And that brings me to tip 2, which is to see it as a heroic act of self-love and love, and a heroic act for your marriage. Because looking at your less than ideal behaviors and patterns actually is a profound act of self-love. When you look at where your patterns are holding you back from what you most want, in this case, connection with your spouse, a great marriage, right? It's like digging for gold, because it is only by first looking that you're able to heal those patterns. And as you heal those patterns, you give yourself the gift of more connection with your spouse. And you give your spouse the gift of having a wonderful relationship with you. And you give your family, especially if you have kids, the gift of a nourishing, wonderful home and example of how to have amazing relationships. So many people would rather just point fingers and turn a blind eye to their own unhelpful patterns that they bring to relationship. And that's the reason why so many marriages fall apart, and even why our world is in turmoil. I really don't think there's a more powerful act of love or a more effective act than being willing to take a loving look at yourself and take responsibility for the challenging and also wonderful things that you bring to your relationship. There's nothing that can more quickly improve your life and the lives of the people you care about. Can you feel how amazing it is to be one of the few people who is courageous enough to look at herself and say, oh yes, I see where I could grow. I see how I can be even more of the loving, caring person I most want to be. And I'm going to do what I can to become her because I want to, because I care, because I love myself, and because I love love, because I love my family, because I love my marriage, because I love the vision of what I know my marriage could be. So really, you are doing this out of love for love. So I want you to help yourself get this even more by answering a couple questions. Are you ready? You could write these down and come back to them, or you could pause after each question. How is it true that looking at these unideal parts of yourself is an act of love? Take some time and really answer that question. And the next question is, how are you amazing for being willing to look at these oh so human parts of yourself? Spend some time and answer that question. All right, so from here on out, I invite you to also think of this work of self-reflection and self-ownership as something you do for love, so that you can do it with love. Yeah? Which brings me to the next tip, tip number 3. Think of this as a practice. Think of looking at your imperfect behaviors and patterns and working to let them go as a practice, one that you do with love. Don't think of these behaviors or patterns as something you must be perfect at never doing again, or else you're a failure. No, they're really things you practice not doing as a path of love. It's a practice, not a perfect. Another way of saying that is approach seeing your less than ideal patterns and working to let them go, not as something you have to figure out right away and totally eradicate, or even as something that you have to be really good at not doing, but as something that you are practicing, that you are working towards doing less. This can really call up more patience with yourself, more self-kindness and self-encouragement, as with anything that we think of as a practice. And so on that note, here are a few more specific tips to bring in more of all of that. So tip 4 is get curious. Just bring in some curiosity around these patterns, around these things that you do that are less than ideal in your relationship. Like you might literally ask yourself, I wonder why I do that. Or, I wonder where I picked this habit up. Interesting. Or I wonder what my unconscious is trying to do by doing that. I wonder what it is about being human that makes this behavior so easy to fall into. That is so interesting to look at, right? You can get interested, you can get curious, you can even be fascinated by it. And as you do, you're going to feel lighter. All right, tip 5, befriend it. We can actually befriend the things we don't love about ourselves by understanding that they are not actually against us, that they are in fact in support of us. So please remember that any behavior you might judge or feel bad about that you do in your relationship, comes from a part of you that ultimately is trying to get you something, that is trying to serve you in some way. Yes, it may not be very skillful. It may not be effective. It may be totally backfiring. It may be wreaking havoc, but it is almost always well-intentioned, meaning it is trying to help in the way that it knows how. I love thinking of these kind of patterns and habits and ways we might react that aren't so great or helpful as our limbic caretakers, our protectors, that really is wanting the best for you, that is your friend. So if you can see it that way, it will feel way less bad to look at. You will feel it is trying to support you. And as you recognize that and feel that, it's actually going to make it easier to really support yourself in a truly effective way, in a way that actually works, right? So I have some more questions that, again, I invite you to write down and answer thoroughly. So how do you think doing this thing, whatever this behavior is trying to serve you? What is it trying to get you? How is it well-intentioned? How is it trying to be your friend? And to say that in a couple other very similar ways, but maybe it will open up some other ways of thinking for you, is how is whatever this backfiring tactic may be or whatever this behavior may be, how is it trying to help you? What is this part of you trying to do for you or your relationship? What need is it trying to meet? And once you find those answers, I have a follow-up question, which is kind of a bonus question. And that is, how might I get that need met in another way? A couple more questions to help you consider this more deeply and make friends with this part of you. If your self-judgment around this behavior was a little sweet toddler, what would you say to it to help it feel more relaxed? And lastly, what does this part of you that feels bad about doing this behavior need to hear from the most deeply loving, wise part of you? Oh my, if you really answer these questions, you're going to feel so much better. You're going to feel like this part of you is a friend. You're going to feel so much lighter and more connected to yourself. Which brings me to tip 6, which I think you'll probably, if you've answered these questions, you'll already be feeling this. But tip 6 is meet yourself with compassion. Meet yourself with love and self-encouragement. And this really means relating and thinking and talking to yourself compassionately and encouragingly. And that actually means noticing when you're not, right? Like observing when you tend to fall into self-judgment mode and self-critical mode. And instead, consciously choosing to say to yourself something like, oh, honey, of course you can fall into blaming mode. Look at what you were modeled. You caught that habit like a virus. And I love how much you want to let that habit go and be a great partner. I love how much you care. And even I know you can do it. And I'm here supporting you and believing in you. Notice when you say something like this to yourself, when you think something like this to yourself, how it opens your heart to yourself. And it frees you of heaviness and shame. And it connects you with you. It strengthens your relationship with yourself. I personally find self-honesty and ownership a total thrill because it helps me love myself with all my shortcomings and imperfections even more deeply when I drop any self-judgment and I come from a place of deep self-acceptance, acceptance of humanness, and encouragement of myself. And I know that with these tips, you can do the same. And that brings me to our final tip, tip 7, which is self-reflect to also celebrate yourself. So use the self-reflections as also a time to look for where you are doing well, where you have grown, to look for even the tiniest ways that you've done so, that you are doing well. This is so important that I made a whole episode about it that I think is a must listen, especially if you tend to not feel amazing about yourself ever, which is probably most of you listening. Or all of you, really. So that episode is number 75. It's called Celebrating versus Overlooking Growth. You can recognize and celebrate the good things you're doing, the successes you're having, the growth you are achieving. It will not only help you feel good, really good, but it will set you up for much more rapid change and growth. And listen to that episode to hear more about that. All right, so those are your tips for today. To review, the tips are understand humanness. Recognize it's part of your humanness, these imperfect ways of being. Tip 2, see self-reflection as a heroic act of love. Tip 3, think of it as a practice, something you are practicing, and it doesn't have to be a perfect. Tip 4, get curious. Look at the behavior from a place of curiosity and interest and fascination. Tip 5, befriend the behavior. See what it's trying to do for you. And that even if it isn't doing a great job at it, it's on your side. It is your friend. Tip 6, meet yourself with compassion. Meet this part of you with compassion. And lastly, self-reflect to celebrate yourself as well. So I want to end by saying the truth is a willingness to see yourself, to look at yourself, all your darkness and lightness, all your beauty and ugliness, all your messy wonkiness and glorious goodness, and to not reject any of it, to instead come in close and accept and love yourself with all of it, is one of the most fiercely loving, intimacy-generating things you can do for yourself and for all of your relationships. Because not only will it allow you to evolve with the most ease, grace, and speed, it will also allow you to hold the most loving space for others in all their messy humanness too, which can only lead to the most deeply intimate, tender, and loving relationship with them as well. So my friend, I hope all of this helps with all of that. And if you're ready to not just look deeply and lovingly at the things you bring to your relationship that keep it from being the most loving one it can, but you also are ready to unwind them and leave them behind, while also building the tangible skills that will make your marriage more and more connected and supportive and loving every day, come coach with me. Over the next 4 months together, we'll launch you into an upward healing cycle in your relationship so you can finally trust that things will feel good and secure and light and loving with your spouse into the future. The next step to feel out if coaching with me is a good fit for you is to fill out the Great Mutual Fit form. I'm going to put that in the description or the podcast notes, as well as the link to learn more about coaching with me. And you can also find that over at www.hspmarriagecoaching.com under the Work With Me tab. All right, my beautiful, oh so human, and oh so wonderful because of it, friends, be oh so well.